The Duke walked past the two women every nobleman wanted and asked the forgotten daughter pouring tea to become his Duchess. The room fell silent. Her father's smile vanished. Her sisters stared at her as though the world had gone mad. Nobody understood why the Duke had ignored beauty, wealth, and polished accomplishment for the quiet girl standing in the shadows. The truth was surprisingly simple. A man who had survived years of war wasn't searching for the most beautiful woman in England. He was searching for peace. In Regency England, noble marriages were never built on love. They were negotiated in drawing rooms, measured in acres, and paid for with family fortunes. When the Duke of Aldridge announced he intended to take a wife, desperate fathers across the country saw him as salvation. Lord Richard Abernathy was one of them. His estate was collapsing beneath mountains of debt. The West Wing leaked every time it rained. His tenants were threatening to leave. If one of his daughters failed to secure a wealthy marriage before winter, everything the family owned would be lost. So he prepared his two eldest daughters like prized jewels. Charlotte possessed breathtaking beauty. Rosalind dazzled everyone with wit and accomplishment. Every smile, every curtsy, every word had been rehearsed for this very day. Nobody spared a glance for the youngest daughter. Hazel wore a plain gray dress, stitched from the leftover fabric after her sister's gowns had been finished. While they practiced charming a duke, she quietly arranged the tea service in the corner, invisible as always. Then 6 horses thundered into the muddy courtyard. The Duke had arrived. Within the next hour, one woman would become a duchess. No one, not her father, not her sisters, and certainly not Hazel herself, could imagine whose name the Duke would choose. Before you find out, I want you to sit with something. Somewhere right now, there is a person doing exactly what Hazel did. Showing up, doing the quiet work nobody claps for, getting stepped over by people who assume loud means valuable. If that's ever been you, even once, hit subscribe before this story starts. Not for me, for her. Stay through to the end, because what happens to Hazel is the kind of ending people like that rarely get, and I don't think you'll forgive yourself for clicking away early. 3 days of rain had turned the carriage drives of Hampshire into thick, sucking bogs. Lord Richard Abernathy did not care. He stood by the tall, drafty windows of the morning room, his breath fogging the glass, his hands clasped so tightly behind his back that his knuckles had gone white. "He's coming," Richard said. The words dropped like stones into the quiet room. Behind him, the Abernathy sisters arranged themselves. It was an exercise in calculated casualness. Charlotte, the eldest by 3 years, sat nearest the hearth. Firelight caught the gold thread woven through her dark hair. She held a piece of needlepoint she hadn't actually worked on in a month. It was a prop. Charlotte understood the mechanics of this afternoon better than anyone. At 24, she was staring down the barrel of spinsterhood. But she was beautiful, sharp, striking, and ambitious enough to choke a horse. "Is his carriage crest visible?" Charlotte asked. She didn't look up. She kept her voice entirely level. "Mud," Richard snapped. "Covered in mud. But it is a crest. 6 horses. Only a duke drives 6 through this slop." On the velvet settee, Rosalind turned a page of her book, French Poetry, Rousseau. She didn't speak French particularly well, but the volume looked good in her lap. Rosalind was the middle child. If Charlotte was the beauty, Rosalind was the wit. She was the one who could quote parliament debates, the one who played the pianoforte with an aggressive mathematical precision. "Do calm down, father," Rosalind murmured, moistening her thumb to turn another page. "If you sweat through your collar before His Grace even crosses the threshold, he will think we are desperate." "We are desperate," Richard snarled, turning from the window. "The roof in the West Wing is rotting. The tenants are holding back rent. If one of you doesn't secure a settlement by Michaelmas, we will be eating the horses." Hazel stood by the sideboard. She didn't say anything. She rarely did when the air in the room got this thick. Hazel was 20. She possessed neither Charlotte's arresting profile nor Rosalind's biting intellect. She was small, pale, and entirely unremarkable. Her dress was a muted gray, not by choice, but because the dressmaker's fabric had run out after outfitting her sisters, leaving only the duller cuts for the youngest. She was currently organizing the tea service, heavy silver, delicate porcelain cups painted with fading blue swallows. She wiped a smudge off a saucer with her thumb. The heavy oak front doors groaned open in the hall beneath them. Boots on marble echoed up the stairs. "Positions!" Richard hissed. He ran a hand over his thinning hair and marched into the hall to intercept his salvation. Hazel stepped back, melting into the shadows beside the heavy velvet curtains. She watched her sisters. Charlotte pinched her cheeks hard, leaving 2 blooming red marks that perfectly simulated a youthful flush. Rosalind snapped her book shut, leaving a finger between the pages to look interrupted. Footsteps approached. Then the Duke of Aldridge entered the room. Sebastian Whitmore did not look like a man who owned half of Derbyshire. He looked tired. He was 31, tall, broad-shouldered, and soaked through. The rain had plastered his dark hair to his forehead. His heavy riding coat dripped water onto the Abernathy's threadbare Persian rug. He didn't carry a cane. He didn't wear a top hat. He looked like a man who had ridden the last 5 miles on horseback, rather than sit in a stuffy carriage, and his boots were caked in gray mud. A faint scar pulled at the corner of his left eye, a souvenir from the peninsula. He had inherited the title a year ago, when his elder brother broke his neck in a hunting accident. Sebastian hadn't been raised to run a dukedom. He had been raised to be a soldier. He stood in the doorway, gray eyes sweeping the room. It was not a look of romantic appraisal. It was a tactical assessment. "Your Grace," Richard boomed, practically vibrating with eager anxiety. "Welcome to Highfield. May I present my daughters?" Charlotte stood first. The rustle of her silk skirt was loud in the quiet room. She dropped into a flawless curtsy, the angle of her neck and the dip of her shoulders engineered to show off her collarbone. "Your Grace," she said, her voice a purr of polite concern. "You must be terribly cold. The roads are wretched this time of year." "They are mud," Sebastian said. His voice was deep, scraping the bottom of his throat. He did not smile. "I apologize for tracking it into your home." "Think nothing of it," Richard laughed, too loudly. "We are honored. Honored. And this is my second daughter, Rosalind." Rosalind rose, keeping her finger in her book, and offered a smaller, more intellectual curtsy. "An honor, Your Grace. I was just reading about the agricultural reforms in the northern counties. I understand your estates have implemented the new crop rotations. A bold move." "Too bold," Hazel thought, from the corner. Sebastian blinked. He looked at Rosalind, then at the book in her hand. "The stewards manage the rotation, Miss Rosalind. I mostly concern myself with the ledgers." The rejection of her intellectual bait was flat and immediate. Rosalind's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, before cementing back into place. "And the youngest," Richard said, waving a dismissive hand toward the sideboard. "Hazel." Sebastian looked past the glowing hearth, past striking Charlotte and ambitious Rosalind. He looked into the shadows. Hazel didn't step forward. She didn't curtsy deeply. She merely inclined her head, her hands still resting flat against the cool mahogany of the sideboard. "Your Grace," she said softly. He held her gaze for a second. Nothing registered on his face. He nodded once, then turned back to Lord Abernathy. "I appreciate your hospitality, Lord Abernathy," Sebastian said, unbuttoning his heavy, wet coat. A footman scuttled forward to take it. "I will only stay an hour. I have business in London by tomorrow evening." An hour. The panic spiked in Richard's chest. An hour to sell a daughter. Of course, Richard babbled. "Please, sit by the fire. Warm yourself. Girls, entertain His Grace." Sebastian sank into the wingback chair. It creaked under his weight. His joints ached. The damp of the English countryside always made the shrapnel in his thigh throb. He stared at the flames licking the soot-stained bricks of the hearth. He hated this. He hated the season, the ballrooms, and most of all he hated these private viewings. He knew exactly why he was here. He needed an heir. He needed a wife. The Dowager Duchess, his terrifying mother, had handed him a list of acceptable breeding stock. The Abernathy girls were on it. Good bloodlines, a bankrupt father. It meant they would be eager, compliant, and cheap to acquire. He wouldn't have to deal with demanding in-laws. He could pay off Lord Abernathy's debts, take a wife back to Derbyshire, shut the door, and be left alone. "May I offer you some wine, Your Grace?" Charlotte asked, hovering at his elbow. Her perfume was overwhelming, lavender and heavy musk. It smelled like a crowded London ballroom, It made his headache worse. "Tea, if you have it," Sebastian said, not looking at her. "I have a long ride ahead." "Of course," Charlotte beamed. She snapped her fingers at her younger sister without looking at her. "Hazel, tea for the Duke." It was a reflex, Sebastian noticed. He didn't say anything, but his eyes tracked the sharp, dismissive snap of Charlotte's fingers. "Tell me, Your Grace," Charlotte continued, sinking gracefully onto the sofa opposite him, leaning forward just enough. "Do you plan to spend the winter in London or at your country estate?" "I have always preferred the country. London is so exhausting." It was a lie. Sebastian could smell it. Women like Charlotte lived for the social season. If he locked her in Derbyshire for the winter, she would go mad and take him down with her. "Derbyshire," he answered flatly. "It is quiet." "I adore the quiet," Charlotte said smoothly. "Do you?" Rosalind interjected, moving to the pianoforte. "You complained just yesterday that the lack of callers was driving you to madness, sister." A flash of pure venom crossed Charlotte's face, gone as quickly as it appeared. Rosalind sat at the bench, arranging her skirts. "Perhaps some music, Your Grace. The weather is so dismal, a little melody might chase the damp away." "If you wish," Sebastian said. He rubbed 2 fingers against his temple. Rosalind didn't play a gentle parlor song, she played a complex, frantic sonata. Her fingers pounded the keys, showcasing her rigorous training, her discipline, her absolute mastery of the instrument. It was loud. In the closed, humid air of the morning room, the notes bounced off the plaster walls and hammered into Sebastian's skull. He closed his eyes. The tension in his jaw clamped down. He was a man who had spent 4 years listening to cannon fire and the screams of dying men in muddy trenches. He didn't want aggressive mastery. He wanted silence. Lord Abernathy stood by the mantel, beaming with pride, oblivious to the way the Duke's knuckles were turning white, where he gripped the arms of the chair. "Splendid, isn't she?" Richard shouted over the crashing chords. Taught by a master from Vienna. Sebastian gave a tight, mechanical nod. He wanted to leave. He looked at the clock on the mantel. 50 minutes left. He could endure 50 minutes. Through the deafening barrage of the sonata, a faint clink of porcelain sounded. Sebastian opened his eyes. The youngest girl, Hazel, was standing at the small table beside his chair. He hadn't heard her approach. She moved with a strange, liquid silence, stepping lightly on the creaking floorboards. She held a cup and saucer. Hazel had watched him since he walked in. She saw the way he favored his left leg. She saw the dark, bruised exhaustion under his eyes. She watched Charlotte suffocate him with perfume and platitudes. She watched Rosalind assault him with Beethoven. He was an animal caught in a trap, too polite to chew off his own leg to escape it. Hazel knew about traps. She had lived in one her entire life. When your sole purpose in a family is to be the background against which your sisters shine, you learn to observe. You learn to read a room. She had prepared the tea herself. The silver pot was heavy, hot against the cotton of her gloves. The Abernathys always served tea with heavy cream and mounds of crystallized sugar, a pathetic attempt to show wealth they didn't possess. But looking at the hard, weathered lines of the Duke's face, Hazel bypassed the sugar bowl. A man who rides through a storm, who looks at a fire with such weary resentment, doesn't want sweet things. She poured the tea dark, a deep, robust amber. No milk, no sugar. She carried it to him while Rosalind struck a particularly violent chord. Hazel didn't interrupt. She didn't offer a smile or ask if he preferred it weak or strong. She didn't ask for his attention at all. She simply lowered the cup and saucer onto the small wooden table at his right elbow. The porcelain made a tiny clink as she set it down. Sebastian looked at the cup, dark tea, steam rising in a thin, straight ribbon. He looked up at her. Hazel was standing close enough that he could smell her. She didn't smell like lavender or musk. She smelled like starch, clean cotton, and a faint trace of rain-soaked earth. It was a grounded smell. Real. "No sugar?" he asked. His voice was low under the noise of the piano. Hazel met his gaze. Her eyes were a strange, pale hazel, caught somewhere between green and gold. They were the most startling thing about her. "You do not strike me as a man who coats a bitter thing in sugar to pretend it is sweet, Your Grace," she said quietly. Her voice was calm, uninflected. There was no flirtation in it, no desperation, It was simply a statement of fact. Sebastian stared at her. The hammering of the pianoforte seemed to recede, dropping away into white noise. He reached out and picked up the cup. His fingers brushed against hers as she pulled her hand away. Her skin was warm. He brought the rim to his lips and drank. The tea was strong, astringent. It burned pleasantly down his throat, cutting through the damp chill that had settled in his bones. "It is exactly right," he said. Hazel gave a bare fraction of a nod. "I'm glad." She didn't linger. She didn't use the opening to launch into a monologue about her hobbies. She simply turned and walked back to the shadows by the sideboard, leaving him with his perfect cup of tea. Sebastian watched her go. He took another slow sip. At the pianoforte, Rosalind struck the final chord, letting it ring out with theatrical triumph. She turned on the bench, chest heaving slightly, a victorious smile pinned to her face. "Beautifully played, Rosalind," Charlotte said, though her voice dripped with acid. She turned to the Duke. "Don't you agree, Your Grace?" Sebastian placed the teacup back on the saucer. "I am afraid I lack the ear for it," he said plainly. Rosalind's smile cracked. "But surely," Lord Abernathy interjected, stepping forward, desperate to regain control of the room, "surely you appreciate a woman of accomplishments. A duchess must host, after all. She must entertain." Sebastian looked at the father, the sweating, frantic man. He looked at the two older sisters, leaning forward like hounds at a fox hunt. "I have no interest in entertaining," Sebastian said. The room went dead silent. Only the rain lashing against the windows made a sound. "My life in Derbyshire is entirely devoid of society. My estate is remote. The house is old, and it is draughty. I do not host balls. I do not attend Parliament unless dragged by the king himself. A woman seeking accomplishments and admiration would perish of boredom within a month." Charlotte's jaw tightened. The prospect of being buried alive in the country without a season was horrifying to her. "But he was a duke." She forced a laugh. "You exaggerate your isolation, surely." "I assure you, Miss Abernathy, I do not." Sebastian stood up. The hour was not over, but he had seen enough. He had made his decision. Richard's face flushed a deep, panicked purple. "Your Grace, please. You have only just arrived. You haven't." "I have seen all I need to see, Lord Abernathy." Sebastian turned to face the room. He didn't look at Charlotte. He didn't look at Rosalind. He looked across the room, past the silver tea service, to the girl in the gray dress standing quietly against the wall. "Miss Hazel." The entire room pivoted. Charlotte's head snapped around. Rosalind stood up from the piano bench. Hazel blinked, stepping slightly out of the shadows. "Yes, Your Grace." "Do you play the pianoforte?" he asked. "No, Your Grace. I have no ear for music." "Do you enjoy London society?" "I have never been to London. I imagine it is loud." Sebastian's chest moved in what might have been a silent laugh. The tight lines around his eyes relaxed marginally. "It is," he agreed. He took a step toward her, the heavy thud of his boots on the floorboards drawing a line of tension through the room. "And if you were entirely isolated in a draughty house in Derbyshire, with no callers and no balls, how would you spend your days?" Lord Abernathy let out a strangled, objecting noise. "Your Grace, Hazel is. She is merely the youngest. She is not out yet. She is not prepared." "I am speaking to her, Lord Abernathy." Sebastian cut him off, his voice carrying the crack of a commanding officer. The father snapped his mouth shut. Sebastian stopped 3 feet from Hazel. He looked down at her, waiting. Hazel didn't flinch under the weight of his stare. She looked back at him, her pale eyes steady. She thought about his muddy boots. She thought about the way he gripped the chair when the music was too loud. She thought about a quiet, draughty house in the country. "I would walk the moors," Hazel said. "I would read in silence. And I would ensure the tea was brewed properly." A heavy, suffocating silence dropped over the Abernathy morning room. Charlotte was staring at her younger sister, as if she had grown a second head. Rosalind's face was pale with outrage. Sebastian Whitmore held Hazel's gaze for a long time. The transaction of the marriage mart vanished. For a fleeting second, it was just two quiet people recognizing each other in a loud, crowded room. "Lord Abernathy," Sebastian said, not breaking eye contact with Hazel. "Yes, Your Grace," Richard stammered behind him. I will speak with you in your study regarding the settlements. Sebastian finally looked away from Hazel, turning his massive frame toward the door. I require no further introductions. I have found my Duchess. The door to the study closed with a heavy, final thud. Lord Richard Abernathy scrambled to the mahogany desk, hands shaking as he gestured to a leather armchair. Sebastian did not sit. He remained standing by the unlit hearth, his frame dwarfing the room. "Brandy, Your Grace," Richard offered, his voice a pitch too high. "Ink," Sebastian replied, "and paper." Richard swallowed the rest of his eager hospitality. He hurriedly pulled a fresh sheet of parchment from a drawer and set a brass inkwell beside it. He hovered, a man waiting for a guillotine to drop or a shower of gold to fall. He wasn't sure which it would be. Sebastian stepped to the desk. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He was a soldier. He dealt in logistics. "I will clear the debts tied to this estate," Sebastian said, his voice flat. "Your creditors in London will be paid by Friday. I will establish an allowance of £800 a year for the maintenance of Highfield, paid quarterly." Richard's eyes widened. £800. It was more than he had dared hope for. It was salvation. He opened his mouth to pour out a fountain of gratitude, but Sebastian raised a single scarred hand. "There are conditions." The Duke leaned his knuckles on the desk, bringing his face closer to Richard's. His gray eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. "First, you will use a portion of that allowance to fix the roof of the West Wing. If I hear your tenants are still living in damp rot by next winter, I will cut the funds entirely." "Yes, absolutely, Your Grace. The roof, of course." "Second, my marriage to your daughter will take place tomorrow morning. A special license. No bands, no guests, no breakfast celebration. We leave for Derbyshire by noon." "Tomorrow?" Richard blanched. Panic briefly overrode his greed. But her trousseau, the modiste, requires weeks. A duke's bride cannot go to the altar in rags. "She will go to the altar in whatever she is wearing," Sebastian said. "I am not buying a dress, Lord Abernathy. I am buying a wife. And the final condition." Sebastian straightened up. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You and your elder daughters are never to set foot in Derbyshire. The allowance is your pension. Consider it the price of my privacy. If you attempt to visit, or if you write asking for more money, the arrangement is void." Richard blinked, the insult warring with the financial relief. The relief won easily. He nodded, jowls shaking. "Agreed, Your Grace. Entirely agreed." "Draft the terms," Sebastian said, gesturing to the paper. "My solicitor will finalize the contract tonight." Upstairs, the silence in the girl's bedchamber was venomous. Hazel knelt on the uneven floorboards, folding a faded woolen shawl into a battered leather trunk. It was one of the few things she owned that hadn't originally belonged to Charlotte or Rosalind. Charlotte paced the length of the room, her silk slippers slapping hard against the wood. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. The red pinch marks on her cheeks had faded into a sickly white. "It is a punishment," Charlotte said, her voice shaking with poorly suppressed rage. "He's mocking us. A man like that, a duke, choosing the scullery maid." "I am not a scullery maid, Charlotte," Hazel said quietly. She placed a pair of thick stockings into the trunk. "You might as well be," Charlotte rounded on her, pointing a trembling finger. "Look at you. You have no grace. You have no conversation. You poured his tea. That is all you did. He chose you because you are a nothing. You are a blank wall he won't have to look at." Hazel didn't look up. Her hands smoothed the rough wool of the stockings. She knew Charlotte was lashing out from the bleeding wound of her own ruined pride. But Hazel also knew Charlotte was right. "I know," Hazel said. The simple agreement halted Charlotte's tirade. She stared at her younger sister, breathing hard. "You know he does not want a wife to love, Charlotte," Hazel said, finally looking up. Her pale eyes were steady, reflecting the weak gray light from the window. "He wants a ghost to haunt his house. He chose me because I am already invisible. It is a terrible insult to you, but it is the truth." Rosalind, who had been sitting on the edge of the bed staring blankly at the wall, let out a short, bitter laugh. "A ghost? You are going to be buried alive in the north, Hazel. The man is a brute. Did you see his hands? He looks like he digs his own ditches." "He looks tired," Hazel corrected mildly. "He will crush you," Charlotte sneered, though some of the fire had gone out of her. She crossed her arms, suddenly looking very cold. You will be a duchess in name, living in a tomb. You will have nothing. Hazel looked back down at her trunk. She thought of the loud, suffocating panic of this house, the constant fear of debt, the relentless competitive shrieking of her sisters vying for attention. She closed the lid of the trunk and fastened the brass buckles. They clicked sharply in the quiet room. I will have quiet, Hazel said. They were married at 10 the next morning in the village chapel. The priest smelled of stale gin and rushed through the liturgy as if he had a train to catch. Hazel wore her Sunday dress, a dark navy wool too heavy for the muggy morning. Sebastian wore a severe black coat. He did not smile. When he slid the heavy gold band onto her finger, his touch was brief and clinical. His hand was warm, his calluses rough against her smooth knuckles. By noon, they were in the carriage. The vehicle was massive, sprung on heavy leather straps and pulled by 6 enormous grays. The interior was upholstered in dark green velvet that smelled of beeswax and old dust. Hazel sat on the forward-facing bench. Sebastian sat opposite her as the carriage lurched forward, leaving the crumbling gates of Highfield behind. Hazel did not look back out the window. She kept her eyes on the silver handle of the carriage door. They did not speak for the first half hour. The rain from the previous days had ceased, but the roads were still deep, treacherous ruts of mud. The carriage swayed violently. Every jolt sent a shock up Hazel's spine. She gripped the velvet seat, keeping herself upright, refusing to brace against the walls. Sebastian watched her. He sat with his arms crossed over his broad chest, his long legs stretched out, taking up most of the floor space. His left leg, the ruined one, was extended rigidly. He observed his new wife with the same detached scrutiny he would use to inspect a new line of infantrymen. She was incredibly still. Most women of his acquaintance, his mother, his late brother's mistresses, would have filled the silence with nervous chatter. They would have complained about the jostling. They would have demanded to know when they were stopping for tea. Hazel did none of these things. She sat perfectly straight, absorbing the brutal shocks of the road in silence. You may lean back, madam, Sebastian said. His deep voice startled her. It was the first time he had spoken since the altar. The upholstery is not made of glass. Hazel blinked, bringing her focus to his face. I'm fine, Your Grace. We have 3 days of travel ahead of us. If you sit like a ramrod the entire way, your spine will snap before we reach the Trent. Hazel slowly relaxed her shoulders, letting her back touch the plush velvet behind her. It was immensely comfortable. She let out a small, quiet breath. Thank you, she said. The silence returned, but the sharpest edge had been blunted. By nightfall, the weather turned foul again. A biting wind swept across the Midlands, driving rain against the carriage windows like handfuls of gravel. They stopped at a coaching inn near Oxford. It was not a place dukes usually patronized. The yard was filled with the shouts of hostlers and the smell of wet horses and manure. Sebastian stepped out first. He didn't offer his hand to help her down. He offered his entire forearm, holding it rigid as she stepped onto the muddy mounting block. The inn's private parlor was already taken by a traveling merchant. The innkeeper, a sweating man in a dirty apron, took one look at Sebastian's cold eyes and the heavy purse in his hand, and miraculously found a small, drafty back room beside the kitchen. Dinner was served on a scarred wooden table. It consisted of tough mutton, boiled potatoes that tasted of dirt, and a jug of weak, sour ale. Sebastian cut into the gray meat. He was accustomed to terrible food. The army had fed him worse for years. He expected his new Duchess, raised in an aspiring aristocratic house, to push the plate away in disgust. He waited for the tears. He waited for the inevitable breakdown. Hazel picked up her knife and fork. She cut a small piece of the mutton, chewed it thoroughly, and swallowed. She took a sip of the ale, didn't grimace, and cut another piece of meat. Sebastian paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. Is it to your liking? He asked, a hint of dark amusement in his tone. It is entirely adequate, Hazel said, without looking up. It is boot leather, madam. Hazel set her fork down. She looked at him across the flickering light of the tallow candle between them. I have eaten worse, Your Grace. When my father's gambling debts were particularly high last winter, the butcher stopped delivering. We ate potato soup for 3 weeks. This is fine. Sebastian stared at her, The blunt, unapologetic honesty of the statement caught him off guard. There was no shame in her voice, no play for pity. It was just a fact. He slowly lowered his fork. "I see. Do not concern yourself with my comfort, Your Grace," Hazel added, picking up her fork again. "I require very little. You will find I am a very cheap investment." The words were spoken softly, but they hit Sebastian like a physical blow. A cheap investment. It was exactly what he had wanted. It was exactly what he had calculated. Hearing her say it out loud, with such total lack of resentment, made a strange, uncomfortable knot tighten in his chest. "Eat your dinner, Hazel," he said gruffly. It was the first time he had used her given name. They finished the meal in silence. This time, the silence was not entirely cold. The Peak District rose around them on the third afternoon, a jagged, unforgiving landscape of dark stone and deep shadowed valleys. The green softness of the south vanished, replaced by wild heather and harsh winds. Hazel pressed her face to the cold glass of the carriage window. She had never seen mountains. The sheer scale of the landscape made her breath catch. It was beautiful, but it was a violent, lonely beauty. "It is bleak," Sebastian said, watching her face. "It is immense," Hazel murmured. The carriage turned off the main road, passing between two massive, weather-beaten stone pillars topped with stone griffins. The iron gates were open, rusting on their hinges. They drove for another 2 miles through a dense, unkempt forest before the trees broke, revealing the estate. Stoneleigh Hall was not a welcoming house. It was a sprawling, brutalist masterpiece of gray stone, built in a defensive square as if expecting a siege. The windows were narrow and tall, reflecting the gray sky like blind eyes. There were no manicured lawns, no blooming flower beds. The wild heather crept right up to the gravel drive. The carriage pulled to a halt before the massive oak front doors. There was no grand reception. A single footman hurried down the steps to open the carriage door. Sebastian climbed out and turned to assist Hazel. She stepped down, the wind immediately tearing at her cloak, whipping her hair across her face. She stood on the gravel, looking up at the towering facade. It looked like a prison, or a fortress. "Welcome to Derbyshire," Sebastian said quietly. They walked up the steps. The heavy doors were pulled open from the inside. The entry hall was cavernous. The floor was black and white checkered marble, dull from lack of polishing. Above them, a massive iron chandelier hung from a vaulted ceiling. The air inside was significantly colder than the air outside. It smelled of wood ash, old paper, and damp stone. Waiting at the base of the grand sweeping staircase was a woman in severe black bombazine. She was tall, gaunt, and held a ring of iron keys at her waist. "Mrs. Gable," Sebastian said, pulling off his leather riding gloves. "This is my wife, the new Duchess of Aldridge." Mrs. Gable did not smile. She offered a stiff, precise curtsy. Her eyes, pale and sharp as a hawk's, darted over Hazel's travel-stained navy dress and plain wool cloak. The housekeeper clearly found the new Duchess lacking. "Your Grace," Mrs. Gable said. Her voice echoed off the bare stone walls. "We were not expecting you so soon. The master suite is not prepared for a bride." "Prepare the East Wing suite for her Grace," Sebastian ordered, throwing his gloves onto a silver tray on a nearby table. "I will remain in my current quarters." Hazel felt a tiny, sharp prick of something in her chest. Not sorrow, just the final, undeniable confirmation of her reality. They were to live in separate wings of a massive, empty house. "As you wish," Mrs. Gable said smoothly, betraying no surprise. "Shall I arrange for tea in the drawing room?" "No, I have letters to write. Send a tray to my study." Sebastian turned to Hazel. He looked massive in the dim light of the hall, his shoulders blocking out the meager light from the open door. "Mrs. Gable will show you to your rooms," he told her. "The house is yours to command. If you require anything, speak to her. We dine at 8. Do not be late." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked away, his boots echoing sharply on the marble floor, his left leg dragging slightly with fatigue. He disappeared down a dark, arched corridor. Hazel was left standing in the freezing hall with a housekeeper who was looking at her like a stain on the rug. "If you will follow me, Your Grace," Mrs. Gable said, turning toward the stairs. They walked up 3 flights of stairs and down a corridor that seemed a mile long. Half the doors they passed were shut, the rooms behind them dead and unused. The silence in the house was absolute. It pressed against the eardrums. Finally, Mrs. Gable unlocked a heavy door and pushed it open. "The East Wing Suite," the housekeeper announced. Hazel walked in. The room was massive. The walls were lined with dark oak paneling. A massive four-poster bed stood in the center, hung with heavy, fading crimson velvet curtains. There was a sitting area by the tall windows, a vanity table, and a cold, empty fireplace. Dust motes danced in the pale light filtering through the glass. It was freezing. "I will send a maid up to light the fire," Mrs. Gable said, lingering in the doorway, "and to unpack your belongings." "That will not be necessary," Hazel said. Mrs. Gable frowned. "Not necessary, Your Grace? A duchess does not unpack her own bags." "I prefer to do it myself," Hazel replied evenly. She turned to face the older woman. She knew what this was. The staff was testing her. They expected a weak, crying girl who had been sold to a monster. "As you wish," Mrs. Gable said. Her tone suggested she thought Hazel was a fool. "Will there be anything else?" "Yes." Hazel walked over to the windows. They looked out over the back of the estate, miles of rolling dark heather stretching toward the horizon. "Send up a pot of tea, loose leaf, not bagged, a kettle of boiling water, unmixed, and no sugar." Mrs. Gable blinked. "No sugar, Your Grace?" "None. Thank you, Mrs. Gable. You are dismissed." The housekeeper stiffened, gave a jerky nod, and pulled the door shut behind her. Hazel was alone. She stood in the middle of the massive, freezing room and listened. There were no carriages rattling on cobblestones. There was no screeching laughter from Charlotte. There was no frantic piano pounding from Rosalind. There was no desperate pacing from her father. There was only the sound of the wind howling against the thick glass of the window. Hazel slowly unclasped her heavy cloak and let it fall to the floor. She walked over to the massive four-poster bed and ran her hand over the carved wooden post. It was solid, real. She walked to the window and looked out at the desolate, beautiful moors. Charlotte had called this place a tomb. Rosalind had said she would be buried alive. Hazel rested her forehead against the cold glass, her lips curving into a small, genuine smile. She had a room of her own. She had silence. She had an entire ocean of space and a husband who demanded absolutely nothing from her but her absence. For the first time in her 20 years of life, Hazel felt like she could breathe. The first month at Stoneleigh Hall established a rhythm built on absence. Sebastian left the house before dawn. He rode the borders of the estate, arguing with tenant farmers, inspecting collapsing stone walls, driving his exhausted body until the phantom pains in his ruined thigh forced him to stop. He ate his meals in his study, a dark room smelling of leather and old dog, though the dog had been dead for 5 years. He saw his wife exactly once a week, on Sunday evenings, when they dined at opposite ends of a 30-foot mahogany table. They exchanged facts, the weather, the crop yield, the cost of coal. It was not a marriage, it was a status report. Hazel did not mind. She spent her days unpicking the deep, rotting decay of the house. She did not play the Grand Duchess. When Mrs. Gable attempted to hand her the daily menus for approval, a stack of heavy, grease-stained cards detailing massive, expensive roasts, Hazel handed them back. "The Duke eats mutton and potatoes," Hazel told the housekeeper, standing in the freezing kitchens. "I eat whatever is available. We are 2 people, Mrs. Gable, not a cavalry regiment. Sell the surplus stores in the village. Use the coin to buy lye soap and beeswax. This house smells like a crypt, and I want the floors scrubbed until they shine." Mrs. Gable bristled. The late Duchess never concerned herself with the scrubbing. "The late Duchess is dead," Hazel replied, her voice entirely flat. "And I live here. Get the soap, Mrs. Gable." Hazel stripped off her heavy wool outer skirts and tied a canvas apron around her waist. She did not order the maids to work. She knelt beside them on the freezing marble floors. She scrubbed the soot from the hearths. She inventoried the linen closets, finding moth-eaten ruin and salvaging what she could. She found a ledger of household expenses in the steward's office and spent 3 nights by the light of a single tallow candle tracking the bleed of money. She discovered that the butcher in the village was charging Stoneleigh Hall double the market rate. She discovered the coal merchant was delivering slate mixed in with the anthracite. She fixed it not with shouting or threats, but with the quiet, ruthless efficiency of a woman who had spent her life watching her father's wealth bleed away through negligence. She rode into the village in a plain cart, spoke to the merchants with terrifying polite precision, and cut the estate's household expenses by 40% in 3 weeks. Finch, the aging, perpetually sweating estate steward, brought the revised books to Sebastian on a miserable Tuesday afternoon in November. Sebastian sat behind his desk, rubbing his temples. The ledgers were usually a source of immense irritation to him. He hated the columns. He hated the numbers. He wanted to hit something, but he was a duke, and there was nothing to hit but paper. He looked down at the book Finch placed before him. The handwriting in the margins was not Finch's frantic scrawl. It was small, sharp, and perfectly legible. "What is this?" Sebastian asked, tapping a column of corrected figures. "Her Grace, my lord," Finch stammered, wiping his brow with a dirty handkerchief. She audited the pantry accounts, and the coal deliveries, and the laundry soap. Sebastian frowned. He looked closer at the ink. "She cut the butcher's bill in half. She threatened to buy a herd of pigs and slaughter them herself in the courtyard if he didn't adjust his prices to the regional standard, Your Grace." There was a note of genuine awe in the steward's voice. Sebastian stared at the neat, merciless numbers. A strange, tight feeling gripped his chest. It was amusement, a deeply buried, rusty sensation. That evening, when he returned from a brutal ride through the freezing rain, he did not go straight to his study. He stopped in the main hall. The air smelled different. The damp rot was gone. It smelled of lemon oil, wood smoke, and clean linen. He walked up the stairs to the east wing. He had not set foot in this corridor since the day they arrived. He stood outside Hazel's door. He could see a thin line of yellow light spilling from underneath the heavy oak. He didn't knock. He didn't want to intrude. He just stood there, listening to the absolute quiet of the house, and realized that for the first time in his life, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt anchored. The next afternoon, Hazel walked into his study. Sebastian was at his desk, surrounded by a chaotic mess of maps and unresolved boundary disputes. He looked up, startled. She was wearing a faded gray dress, sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her hands were red from cold water, and there was a smudge of ink on her chin. She carried a silver tray. On it, a single cup of tea, dark amber, no milk, no sugar. She didn't announce herself. She walked to the desk, shifted a map of the northern boundary just enough to make room, and set the cup down. The porcelain clicked softly against the wood. "You have been working for 6 hours," Hazel said. Sebastian looked at the tea, then at her. "There is a dispute over the grazing rights on the western ridge. The tenants are threatening to burn each other's barns." Hazel looked at the map. She didn't feign ignorance, and she didn't apologize for looking. "The western ridge is mostly shale. The grass is thin. They aren't fighting over grazing rights, Your Grace. They are fighting over the water access at the bottom of the incline." Sebastian paused. He looked down at the map, tracing the blue line of the stream that cut through the valley. He had been looking at property lines, at acreage. He had been thinking like a soldier holding a perimeter. He hadn't thought about the sheep. He looked back up at her. "How do you know that?" "Because sheep cannot drink rocks," Hazel said simply. "Move the boundary line 50 yards east. Give them both access to the stream. The argument will end." She turned and walked out of the room, her boots clicking softly on the floorboards, leaving him alone with the map. Sebastian picked up his pen, dipped it in the inkwell, and drew a new line 50 yards to the east. He picked up the teacup. It was still hot. It tasted perfect. From that day on, she brought the tea herself. She never stayed long. Sometimes they didn't speak at all. She would set the cup down, perhaps straighten a stack of chaotic papers with a quick, efficient movement of her hand, and leave. Sometimes he would ask her a question about the household ledgers, and she would answer with brutal numeric honesty. It was a strange, functional intimacy. They were two gears in a massive broken machine, finally beginning to catch and turn together. Winter in Derbyshire did not announce itself. It broke down the door. In late January, a storm rolled off the peaks, black and violent. By noon, the sky was the color of bruised iron. By 3, the wind was screaming around the stone towers of Stoneleigh Hall like a wounded animal. The snow fell so thick and fast that the stables, 50 yards away, vanished in a whiteout. Inside the house, the temperature plummeted. The massive stone walls, usually a defense, turned into an icebox. The heat from the fireplaces was sucked straight up the chimneys. Sebastian was in his study, wearing his heaviest riding coat indoors, trying to read a letter from his solicitor. The wind rattled the heavy glass panes in their lead casings. A sharp, explosive crack echoed through the house, followed by the terrifying sound of shattering glass and a roar of wind. Sebastian dropped the letter. He grabbed a heavy iron poker from the hearth and ran into the corridor. The cold hit him like a physical wall. The noise was coming from the long gallery on the second floor, a massive vaulted room lined with tall, fragile Elizabethan windows. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his bad legs screaming in protest, but the adrenaline drowned it out. He burst into the gallery. One of the massive 12-foot windows had blown inward. The wind was violently funneling into the room, bringing a horizontal blizzard with it. Snow was rapidly burying the Persian rugs and whipping against the family portraits. The pressure in the room was immense, threatening to blow out the rest of the glass. Sebastian cursed violently. He needed canvas. He needed heavy oak boards from the cellar. He needed 3 footmen, but the servants' quarters were in the opposite wing, and the bell pulls were frozen solid. He stepped into the teeth of the wind, shielding his face with his arm, trying to reach the heavy velvet curtains to pull them across the breach. But the wind tore the fabric out of his hands, snapping it like a whip. "Leave the curtain!" a voice shouted over the roar. Sebastian whipped his head around. Hazel was running down the gallery. She was dragging a massive, heavy canvas drop cloth, the kind used by painters to cover furniture. She had a coil of thick hemp rope slung over her shoulder and a hammer gripped in her right hand. She wore no coat, only a heavy woolen shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her hair already whipping into a frantic halo around her face. "Hazel, get out of here," Sebastian roared, stumbling back as a gust of wind nearly knocked him off his feet. "The glass!" She ignored him. She threw the heavy coil of rope at his chest. He caught it by reflex. "The brass fixtures on the wall," Hazel shouted, pointing to the heavy sconces mounted between the windows. "Tie off the corners. The canvas is too thick to nail into the stone." Sebastian stared at her for a fraction of a second. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't screaming. She was organizing a defense. He moved. He grabbed the top corner of the canvas. It was stiff and freezing. The wind caught it like a ship's sail, nearly ripping it from his grip. His boots slipped on the snow-covered floorboards. Hazel threw her entire body weight against the bottom of the canvas, pressing it toward the shattered window frame. "Pull, Sebastian." It was the first time she had used his name. The sound of it, screamed over the howl of the blizzard, sent a shock through his blood, hotter than any fire. He planted his good leg, wrapped the rope around the brass sconce, and pulled with all the brutal, terrifying strength he possessed. The canvas stretched taut, covering the top half of the gaping hole. The wind shrieked, fighting them. Hazel dropped to her knees in the accumulating snow, her fingers numb, frantically tying the bottom corners to the lower iron radiator grates. Her knuckles scraped against the stone, leaving bright red smears of blood. She didn't stop. Sebastian moved to help her. They worked shoulder to shoulder in the freezing vortex. He slammed his body against the canvas, holding it flush against the wall while she pulled the knots tight. He could feel the desperate, shivering heat of her through her thin dress. "Done," Hazel gasped, falling back onto her heels. The canvas snapped violently under the wind's pressure, but the ropes held. The horizontal blizzard stopped. The gallery was plunged into sudden, dim shadow. The roar of the storm muffled to a heavy, threatening rumble. They sat in the snow on the floorboards, chests heaving, surrounded by shattered glass. Sebastian looked at her. Hazel was trembling violently. Her lips were blue. Blood dripped slowly from her raw knuckles, stark and bright against her pale skin. Her hair had pulled entirely free of its pins and lay plastered against her wet cheeks. She looked terrifying. She looked beautiful. He didn't think. He didn't weigh the logistics. He reached out and grabbed her. Sebastian pulled Hazel against his chest, wrapping his heavy, dry coat around her shivering body. She gasped at the sudden contact, stiffening for a second before the desperate need for warmth overrode her caution. She collapsed against him, burying her face in the wool of his lapel. "You little fool," Sebastian breathed, his voice raw, his chin resting on the top of her head. You could have been ripped out the window. You were losing your grip on the curtain, Hazel murmured, her voice muffled against his chest. Her hands, freezing and bloody, gripped the fabric of his shirt. You needed the canvas. I needed you to be safe. The words slipped out before he could catch them. They hung in the freezing air, heavier than the snow. Hazel tilted her head back. She looked up at him, her pale hazel eyes wide, searching his face in the dim, storm-filtered light. The cynical, distant Duke was gone. The man holding her was terrified, exhausted, and desperately holding on to her as if she were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. He slowly lifted a hand, his rough thumb brushing a wet strand of hair from her cheek. He was careful, so incredibly careful, as if she were made of glass. Your hands are bleeding, he said softly. They will heal, she answered. Sebastian didn't let her go. He stood up, taking her weight with him, ignoring the sharp spike of pain in his thigh. He kept his arm securely around her waist. Come, he said. The kitchen hearth is the only fire that will survive this draft. They didn't go to their separate wings. They walked down the stairs, leaning on each other. When they reached the kitchen, the servants were huddled in a terrified mass near the ovens. Seeing the Duke walk in, covered in snow, holding the Duchess tightly to his side, sent a shockwave of silence through the room. Sebastian ignored them. He pulled a heavy wooden bench directly in front of the massive roasting fire. He sat Hazel down, took a clean towel from a paralyzed scullery maid, and knelt in front of his wife. He took her hands. He didn't speak. He gently, meticulously wiped the blood and snow from her knuckles. The warmth of the fire baked into their wet clothes. The storm raged outside, burying the manor, cutting them off from the world entirely. Hazel watched the top of his dark head as he cleaned her cuts. She watched the tension in his broad shoulders slowly unwind. For a man who wanted a ghost, he was holding her very tightly to the earth. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't really a story about a duke and a duchess. It's a story about being the last person anyone thinks to save, and getting saved anyway. If that hits something in you, tell me in the comments where in your life you've been the girl pouring the tea nobody noticed. I read every one. And if you want to see whether Hazel gets to keep this, whether the family that discarded her ever has to watch what they threw away, stay with me. Don't let this be the video you close halfway through. She didn't get to walk away from her story. Don't walk away from hers. The storm raged for 3 days, burying Stoneleigh Hall under 4 feet of snow. The estate was an island. The silence that followed was total. It was not the cold, oppressive silence of a dead house. It was the heavy, muffled peace of a world wrapped in cotton. Sebastian did not return to his study. The temperature in the main house remained brutally cold, so they confined themselves to a small oak-paneled sitting room on the ground floor, keeping a massive fire roaring in the hearth day and night. They shared the space. It was an awkward, delicate dance at first. Hazel sat in a wingback chair reading a leather-bound history of the county. Sebastian sat on the sofa trying to read a novel he had pulled at random from the library. He spent more time looking over the top of the pages at her than he did reading. He watched the way she chewed her bottom lip when the text became dense. He watched the way she rested her bandaged hands carefully on her lap. He felt a constant, magnetic pull to bridge the 6 feet of carpet between them. On the evening of the 4th day, the wind finally died. The moon broke through the clouds, casting brilliant, stark white light across the snow-covered moors. Hazel set her book down. She stood and walked to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain to look out at the silver landscape. "It looks clean," she said quietly. Sebastian closed his book. He stood and walked over to her. He didn't stop at a polite distance. He stopped directly behind her. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating off his chest. "It does," he agreed. His voice was low, vibrating in the quiet room. He looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the window. Hazel. She didn't turn around, but she leaned back just a fraction of an inch. It was a microscopic surrender. "When I came to your father's house," Sebastian said slowly, carefully choosing his words, "I told him I wanted peace. I thought peace meant isolation. I thought it meant emptiness." Hazel kept her eyes on the snow outside. Sebastian raised his hands. He hesitated for a second, before resting them on her shoulders. His grip was firm, grounding. He felt her take a slow, deep breath, but she didn't pull away. Now, Sebastian said, his thumbs tracing the line of her collarbone through the wool of her dress. I realize an empty house is just a tomb. I didn't want a ghost, Hazel. I was just too damaged to know how to ask for a partner. I was afraid of the noise. I was afraid of the demands. I thought any woman I brought here would look at me and see only the limp, the scars, and the isolation. Hazel finally turned around. She was trapped between him and the window, but she didn't look frightened. She looked up into his gray eyes. The hardened, cynical armor he wore like a second skin was completely stripped away. He looked entirely vulnerable. Charlotte would have demanded London, Hazel said plainly, her voice steady. Rosalind would have demanded brilliant conversation in society. And what do you demand? Sebastian asked, searching her face. Hazel reached up. She placed her small, bandaged hands flat against the lapels of his coat. She felt the heavy, steady thud of his heart beneath the wool. I demand you drink your tea before it goes cold, she said. A startled, genuine laugh broke from Sebastian's chest. It was a deep, rusty sound, startling in the quiet room. The tension in his jaw vanished. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a pragmatic solution to a dynastic problem, not as a quiet girl in a gray dress, but as the absolute center of his world. He slid his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against him. The physical reality of him was overwhelming, solid, warm. Is that all? He murmured, leaning down, his face inches from hers. I also demand you stop working at 3 in the morning, Hazel whispered, her breath catching as his hand moved up to cup her jaw. The ledgers will still be there at dawn, and I require you to let me fix the roof in the west wing. Done, Sebastian said. He kissed her. It wasn't a tentative, polite kiss. It was desperate. It held months of silent observation, of repressed longing, of the absolute, crashing realization that he had stumbled blindly into the greatest fortune of his life. Hazel kissed him back with a fierce, answering heat. She looped her arms around his neck, anchoring herself to him. She tasted like tea and survival. He tasted like smoke and safety. All the cold, calculating transactions that had brought them together burned away, leaving only this stark, undeniable truth. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing heavily. Sebastian rested his forehead against hers, keeping his arms tightly around her waist. He closed his eyes. Move your trunks, he said, his voice rough. Hazel blinked. Move them where? Out of the east wing. Sebastian opened his eyes, looking directly into hers. There was no hesitation, no retreat. The master suite is large enough for 2. I am entirely finished with living in a separate house from my wife. Hazel felt a slow, brilliant warmth bloom in her chest. She smiled, a real smile, reaching all the way to her pale hazel eyes. Mrs. Gable will be scandalized, Hazel noted. Mrs. Gable works for you, Sebastian said, pressing a kiss to her temple. She will adapt, or she will pack. They stood by the window for a long time, watching the moonlight on the snow. The massive, drafty house around them was still silent, but the nature of the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of abandonment. It was the comfortable, deep quiet of a shared life. It was the peace of a door closing against the world, and knowing that exactly who you wanted was locked inside with you. When spring finally arrived in Derbyshire, it came with a violent thaw. The snow melted into the streams, turning them into rushing torrents. The moors exploded into a sea of purple heather. Highfield received its quarterly allowance on time, down to the final penny. Lord Richard Abernathy paid his gambling debts and immediately accrued new ones. Charlotte married a minor baron who was 70 years old and entirely deaf, moving to a townhouse in London where she hosted loud, desperate parties. Rosalind wrote scathing poetry about the tragic isolation of women and refused 3 respectable offers of marriage because the men did not read enough Greek. They never visited Stoneleigh Hall. They considered Hazel a tragic casualty, a girl sacrificed to a monster in the dark, cold north. They were entirely wrong. Hazel stood on the terrace, watching the sun break over the distant peaks. She wore a dress of deep, rich green velvet, a stark contrast to the faded grays of her past. She held a steaming cup of dark tea. Behind her, the heavy glass doors opened. Sebastian stepped out onto the stone, his gait slightly uneven, holding a thick ledger. He looked tired, but the dark, bruised exhaustion under his eyes was permanently gone. He walked up behind her, sliding his free arm around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He kissed the side of her neck, breathing in the scent of starch and rain-soaked earth. "The western boundary dispute is settled," he murmured against her skin. "And Finch says the new roof will be finished by August." Hazel leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. She took a sip of her tea. It was bitter, strong, and perfectly hot. "Good," she said quietly. "Then we will have time to rebuild the glass house before winter." Sebastian chuckled, a low rumble against her back. He took the teacup from her hand, took a sip himself, and handed it back. They stood together on the terrace, two quiet people looking out over their untamed, beautiful world, entirely content with the silence they had built together. She spent 20 years being the last one anyone looked at, and it turned out that was never the weakness her family thought it was. It was the exact thing that saved her. If Hazel's story reminded you that the quiet ones are watching, learning, and waiting for their moment, don't let this be a video you scroll past without a trace. Subscribe now, because the next woman written off by everyone around her is already waiting in the next story, and she deserves someone in her corner too. Tell me in the comments what you'd have done differently in that morning room. I want to know who noticed her the way the Duke did.